I'm Aaron Rutten, and this is a demonstration of the watercolor brush pack I created for Procreate. You can download these brushes from my website at aaronrutten.com. Before we get into each of the brushes, I'd just really quickly like to mention that I'm using a template here which has a paper texture overlay, and this overlay helps my watercolor brushes look more natural. You can watch my video about the basics of digital watercolor to learn more about using templates like this. The first brush we'll look at is called Drippy. I'll use firm pressure to paint a stroke with this brush. Then I'll use lighter pressure. Now I'll vary my pressure between light and heavy. As you can see, when I use firmer pressure, I get a more opaque stroke. The stroke is also solid. If I use lighter pressure, then I get a very thin, transparent stroke that is also very broken up, and you get more of this paper grain. If I increase my brush size, then I can make those dripping features larger. When I use lighter pressure, you can see that I'm really just depositing less paint or the paint is less concentrated, so I don't get all that fringe along the edges, and it's also very thin. And I can get something that's kind of in between as well. Many of these brushes are very dynamic, so they respond really well to pen pressure. For example, I can create a lot of fringe like this, but then lighten my pressure to sort of blend it out. Maybe I'm diluting this watercolor paint with water. If I add in another color to that, we'll concentrate it with heavy pressure and then lighten it out and let it blend together. Now, depending on how you use these brushes, you might get a watercolor effect or maybe even an ink or gouache effect. In this case, since these are watercolor brushes that I'm demonstrating, we're going to try to stick to a watercolor effect. When you're layering up colors, what you'll want to do is create a new layer, and you can set it to multiply, then duplicate that layer. This way you'll always have a new layer that's already set to multiply. On that new layer, if I layer up my color, now you can see it blends together in a way that looks more like watercolor. The colors blend together darker. So again, if I wanted to add in another layer, I'll just duplicate that extra layer. Let's select yellow this time, and we can blend in some yellow into that. Many of these brushes can also be used as blenders. I'll tap and hold on the blender, and now you can see Drippy has become a blender. Before I can blend these colors together, I'll need to merge their layers. And now, as you can see, I can mix those colors, fade out their edges, pull it out into transparency, and so on. In addition to making brush strokes, you can also dab with many of these brushes. Make my brush smaller, and I'll pull down some drips like this, and we can get sort of a drippy or runny effect. So as you can see, these brushes are very versatile. The next brush I'll demonstrate with is Fringe Buildup. I'll paint a stroke with this brush, and you can see that it has fringe along the edges where the paint is more concentrated. You can see that if I paint strokes, but the other part of the brush name is Buildup, which means that as I make strokes, they build up darker and darker. The paint becomes more and more concentrated. If I use heavy pressure with this brush, then I'm going to get a nice thick layer of paint. But if I use light pressure, then I get the paint to really dilute into wetness, or maybe even erase. So with this one brush, I can layer up color, and I can blend it out, and I can get all sorts of different effects. Here's Fringe Rough. If I paint a stroke with this brush, you can see it has a lumpiness to the paint. This can be useful to give you sort of a bristly effect when you make strokes, or you can build up paint that just has a bit of variability in it and isn't so perfectly smooth. If I use lighter pressure, then I'm going to fade this paint out to transparency or make it look more diluted by water. And then of course I can build up strokes if I want it to be thicker and bolder. And I can mix in other colors as well. If I make a stroke and then paint across it with lighter pressure, you can see it's also sort of abrasive. It eats into the paint that's already on the canvas and smudges it around. Once you lift your pen up though, you won't be able to blend paint that's already on the canvas, so this only affects the current stroke. Let's take a look at Watercolor Dry Paper. I'll paint a stroke with this brush. You can see it has that really nice fringe, and if I use lighter pressure, I can fade my paint out into wetness. The appearance of watercolor is affected by a lot of different properties, from the wetness of the paper to the type of paper being used, so this brush is trying to give the look of using watercolor on paper that is dry. So you can sort of see that in this area here, where there is some wetness in the pigment, but the edges aren't bleeding out into the paper because the paper is dry. We'll mix another color in so you can see how it blends together. These brushes can also utilize opacity, though it works a bit different than what you might expect. When opacity is high, the paint is thin and transparent. You can see through it, it smudges around very easily, and it feels very wet. However, when you lower the opacity, rather than getting more transparent, the paint actually gets more opaque. So as you can see, it's thicker, it doesn't smudge around as easily, and it becomes more viscous. So just be aware that this slider is sort of inverted. Let's have a look at Watercolor Fringe Abrasive next. I'll start my stroke with heavy pressure, and then gradually lighten my pressure. And you can see that when I use lighter pressure, the paint is more streaky and textured, and it's also more abrasive, meaning it kind of cuts through itself. With this brush, you can use the abrasive effect on paint that's already been applied to the canvas. So as you can see on this current layer, I can cut through the paint, plow through it, and lift it from the canvas. Lay down some more paint, lift my pen, and I can easily cut through it. Watercolor Fringe Smooth is next. This is another brush that has fringe along the edges, but the edges are quite smooth and not too rough, and the concentration of the paint is quite smooth as well. Let's give Watercolor Jitter a try. I'll paint a stroke with this brush, and you can see the opacity varies or jitters. So if I paint some strokes that I build up like this, it creates a lot of variability in the paint concentration. You can also do dabs with this brush using your finger. Let's move on to Watercolor Lumpy. I'll use medium pressure to paint with this brush, and you can see it has a lot of lumpiness to it. If I use heavier pressure, the paint will get thicker, but the stroke will also become more filled in and broken. This brush could work well for creating trees. As you can see, I can get a basic tree shape here. But you could also use it to create splatter effects. It has a bit of color variability, as you can see. Let's try a watercolor mix next. This brush works well if you want to just lay down a little bit of paint and then blend it into something. So as you can see, my initial dab is pretty thick, but if I continue painting, it just automatically switches to a blender. So it just makes short little strokes like this. One way you could use this is if you were painting skin and you wanted to add just a little bit of rosiness to a cheek or something, this brush would work well for that. Watercolor Taper is a very useful brush. I'll make my brush just a bit larger, and if I make a stroke that's fairly quick, you can see it tapers at the end, which makes it really easy to create grass and other sorts of details that are pointy on the end. I'll select a dark brown color, and I could also use this for creating branches and tree trunks. I'll demonstrate with wet rough dabs next. Since this is a dab brush, I can dab with my brush tip, or I can even use my finger just to make short little strokes. But I'm not limited to making dabs. I can also build up strokes like this that have very speckled rough edges. You can see this particular brush is very concentrated. This brush also makes an exception to the inverted opacity, and if I lower the opacity, then the paint gets thinner. If I paint another color over this, you can see it really is more transparent rather than just being lighter in color. Let's see what wet Runny can do. Paint a stroke with this brush, and you can see it has very soft details, and there's a lot of variability in the concentration of the paint. I can use lighter pressure to fade it out and make it look more diluted, or heavier pressure to make it look more thick and concentrated. This is a brush that would work really well for painting a sky, because you get all these nice cloudy effects. This is another brush where the opacity slider works as intended. So as you can see, I can reduce the opacity and I can make the concentration of the paint thinner. The lumpiness also becomes more uniform. Well, let's take wet Splat Dabs for a spin. Since this is a dab brush, I can dab with the tip of my pen. Lighter pressure is going to give me more broken splats, whereas they'll be more thicker and filled in if I use heavier pressure. And again, I can even use my finger as long as I make short little strokes. If I make my brush larger, this is another brush that might work really well for painting trees. You can see it is a little abrasive. And I can add in other colors. And again, lowering the opacity for this particular brush does indeed make the paint less opaque. Here's Wet Splat Drips. If I paint with this brush, you can see I get all these really great drippy effects. And add in some other colors to that. Now because of the blend mode I'm using, the paint is layering up opaquely as if it's gouache. So I'll go back here, I will create a new layer, make sure it's set to multiply. And now when I paint the splats, they blend in a way that looks like watercolor. Create another multiply layer, and layer it up some more. And again, if you wanted to blend the colors together, merge your layers first, select the smudge mode, and you can easily blend all these colors together to create all sorts of interesting patterns and textures. The final brush in this collection is Wet Wispy. If I paint a stroke that builds up with this brush, you can see it has all of these different scratches and streaks and splatters in it. And if I build it up, I just get all sorts of random detail. If I make my brush smaller, then those features will be smaller. And again, I can switch this to a blender, and I can blend it all together. Go back to painting, and add in another color. Lighter pressure will give me thinner, transparent paint, and heavier pressure will give me thicker, more opaque paint that spreads out more. And again, if I want this to look like watercolor, then I can layer this up on multiply layers. There you have it. That was a demonstration of the watercolor brush pack I created for Procreate. Download these brushes now from my website at aaronrutten.com.